Asyle, the Engineer, and the Island. Week 17, Day 1. It has now officially been 4 months since I came to this island, and to say I've accomplished a lot would be an understatement. However, I've got so much stuff now, with so many moving parts, that I could easily experience a major setback if anything went wrong or broke, assuming I don't get flat out injured. Therefore, I decided that it would be prudent to dedicate the first day of each month from now on to the maintenance of my base and equipment, going over the things I've built in the order I've built them, and looking for signs of wear or things that need to be replaced. I started today with the automated fishing line and birdhouses as I went about my morning chores. Many of the snood lines had broken off the fishing line, and I replaced them, along with making some new fishing hooks, which didn't take long using my workshop equipment. I didn't get a lot of actual fishing or foraging done during that time, but I have plenty of food stockpiled, so it's not a big deal. I also noticed that the pulley on the turbine slipped a little when the line was under a heavy load, so I borrowed some rosin from the music machine to help it grip better. I then gave my beach hut a once-over, gathering some leaves to plug any spots on the roof I remembered leaking from time to time, and cleaning out the gaps in the rotating wall. I checked on the catamaran with some residual unease. It was still tied to the tree, and aside from the sail and mast, it was more or less in ship shape, though I still have no intention of taking it out on the open water anytime soon. The rubber stills and solar dehydrator that I made for the boat still work fine, but have been rendered a bit redundant by the solar tower, so I stowed them away in the kitchen until they're needed again. I checked on the taro and yam garden, and they're growing in nicely. Probably be ready to harvest soon. I took a few of the larger yams from under the hydroponic cover for dessert later today, sweet and starchy. I dug up one of the taros too, to see how they were growing, before putting it back. Because the taros are largely immersed in water, there wasn't a lot of weeding I needed to do, and the lotuses I added to the ponds helped crowd out any other water weeds that might have grown there. I noticed that some tropical frogs have taken up residence in this pond as well, and I made a mental note to describe them in my journal of island fauna later. I checked that the water coming from the solar tower was a safe temperature, that the small pumping turbine was still working properly, and that there weren't any obvious leaks in the water lines. I found a handful and shut off the water for the day to seal them up with some latex and cord. I checked on the kitchen and sealed up any cracks I found in the kiln or structure with clay and mortar. The banana and vanilla grass plants I planted around the building seem to be doing well, and the bats are always hanging around in the morning waiting for a treat. I restocked the firewood under the counter and made a list of additional kitchenware and utensils I thought might come in handy. I cleaned out some of the soot that had built up on the ceiling around the mosaic, and greased up the ceiling fan while I was up there. I checked on the refrigeration system, making sure that the stellar radiator panels were opening and closing properly under temperature, and that there were no leaks in the adsorption refrigeration system or pipes. I did find and seal a few, particularly a leak in the cellar, where there was a strong smell of ethanol. I had to be careful not to pass out down there, so I made a quick and dirty snorkel in the workshop and used it to breathe while I cleaned up the spill and sealed the leaks, before refilling the system with ethanol and restarting it. I checked on the workshop, which has probably gotten more use and wear than anywhere else in the base so far. The bamboo and harakeke I planted around the building seemed to be doing well, and I sealed up any cracks in the cistern or clay walls as I found them. I made a note to create some proper roof tiles for the building to replace the thatch when the wet season comes around. I stopped the water wheel and checked for wear on the bearings, so I replaced them and added a little coconut oil to keep things lubricated. There were also a few places on the water wheel itself that had become damaged from the constant water exposure, so I took some time to replace and retie the worn members of the wheel. On the inside, the belt train off the main axle seemed like it would last a while longer, but I noticed some additional wear on the lathe bearings and replaced them. The cutting tip also looked like it could stand to be replaced and reinforced. I checked on the sewing machine mechanism I built into it as well, and I suspected that I would need to make a batch of replacement needles before the ones I had broke. I checked on the drill press, greased up the bearings, and decided that I needed to make some replacement drill bits. The grindstone and thread spinner mechanisms have seen a lot of action over the past few months, and while the grindstone was fine, at best needing its grooves sharpened, the spinner mechanism was getting pretty gummed up, so I took some time to clean it and grease up any and all moving parts. This then led me to check on the loom, and almost every part of that monstrosity needed some grease or adjustment, as I noticed, even when I was just using it for making concrete support mesh, that it was skipping a lot of mesh overlaps. It just wasn't as critical for that process. I identified the suspect pegs and gave them special treatment. At least the washing machine was new enough that it didn't need any attention. I stopped for lunch and then checked on the lab, stopping the turbine to make sure that all the mechanisms were secure and to grease up any moving parts. I discovered at this point that there had been a hitch in the electrolysis rig. A loss of connectivity in the carbon leads basically left the machine sparking away uselessly for who knows how long, apparently burning some of the leads completely, and retarding or even reversing some of the electrolytic reactions in my cells. I'm lucky the whole lab didn't catch on fire. Still, it is an irritating setback, and I took some time to make better leads, carefully coating the carbon-covered wires with latex this time to keep them from reacting with oxygen in case this ever happens again. After that, I took stock of the various compounds I had stored there and got a slate to write down my inventory on for future reference. I checked on the bathhouse, starting with the roof, checking for cracks and reinforcing any that I found. I still saw no need to remove the scaffolding underneath, though while I was up there on my ladder, I cleaned off the soot spots from my lanterns. I checked the pool cover under the dining table, and fortunately it hadn't been submerged long enough for any rot to set in, but I made a note to varnish them anyway, or coat them with latex for waterproofing. I checked the pool itself, and it wasn't leaking, and because it's covered most of the time, there was no algae building up in it either. There was a little bit of dirt and bits floating around near the top, though, so I made a note to adjust the drain pipe so it would connect to the intake of the solar tower. This way, the pool water can be recycled, and I can clean it while it's empty. I could also probably stand to dissolve a little potash in the water to help keep microbes from growing in it, like using chlorine in a regular pool. I could probably make chlorine from the electrolysis of salt water, but I don't really want to. I checked on the cistern, which is held up better than the one at the workshop since it's made of concrete instead of clay, and the shower system seemed to be fine as well. The toilet still worked, but definitely needed to be cleaned, so I started the onerous task of emptying the compost canister into the composting bin out back, though mercifully the canister had already done a lot of that work already. I washed off and took note that the red pinecone plants, frangipane flowers, and jasmine I planted around the bathhouse have apparently gotten used to their new home and are starting to recover from transplanting. Finally, I checked on the solar tower, looking carefully for cracks or leaks on the outside of the tower, the cisterns of which have probably been almost completely filled by now. Even small leaks were easily visible as dark streaks down the outside of the tower, and I did my best to patch them up with mortar. I noticed that the texture of the tower's surface wasn't particularly attractive because of the grating and scaffolding, and I made a note to touch up the outside a bit. I had a look under the elevator to make sure the counterweight was okay, and that all the rope connections to it were not fraying, before slowly making my way up the tower, checking the ropes for fraying and the pumps and pipes for leaks. Didn't seem to be any trouble there. When I got to the top, I looked over the reflector panels, which was kind of difficult in the bright light, looking for cracks or misalignments, and carefully reaching up to fiddle with the holding cords as necessary. There was some sagging in a few reflector plates, and even whole panels, so I tightened them up, and made sure that the black rubber bands being used for automatic alignment hadn't begun cracking or anything from exposure to UV light and the elements. No issues yet. That just about covered me for the day, and gave me a few things to do tomorrow. So I started on the tasks that would take the most time before the day ended, namely building some pipes and valves for the pool drain, and using some of the clay left over from digging out the amphitheater to prepare some terracotta tiles for the roof of the workshop. I just made some flat sheets of clay, and draped them over a couple of logs to make them partially cylindrical, like the roof tiles I've seen on some Spanish or Mexican buildings. Each tile is about half a square foot, and the workshop is about 15 by 10 feet, so I needed about 300 tiles. Even taking 5 minutes to make each tile, I finished within an hour. Then I got ready for bed. Week 17, Day 2. When I got up in the morning, I loaded some of the roof tiles into the kitchen kiln before it could get hot out, and while I was out foraging, I collected some sap for varnish. I think I'll make that part of my daily routine, along with the latex collection, because I have a lot of wooden things that would benefit from a little weatherproofing. When I got back, I set part of the sap distilling for turpentine, and hooked up the pool to start it draining. I considered putting a filter on the end of the drain, but then I remembered that diaphragm pumps can handle junk getting into them much better than other kinds of mechanical pumps, and it would just end up mixed in with the salt in the kiln anyway. That reminded me that the kiln was in the middle of cooking tiles, so I couldn't empty the pool anyway. Instead, I spent the morning working on some of the smaller things on my to-do list, making sewing needles, drill bits, and pieces of kitchenware. Among other things, like clay bowls, plates, and cups, I made a bunch of bamboo tongs to use as utensils, with cord joints and rubber bands to hold them open. I used them kind of like chopsticks back home, though with a wider grabbing surface and greater ease of use, because I always hated touching my food, potentially getting my fingers greasy and transferring that grease to any project I would work on later, or potentially transferring germs from my hands to my mouth. But sometimes that was just an easier way to manipulate a food item than with a fork or spoon. Tongs seemed to provide the best of both worlds, and by carving some points on the end of these ones, they could still function as a fork when using a knife to cut food up, truly the ultimate utensil. By that time the turpentine was done, so I headed out to the forest again to collect a bit more sap and chestnut oil to make varnish, and then started working on varnishing the underside of the pool cover. I stopped for lunch halfway through, and didn't have quite enough varnish to finish the job, so I'll have to pick it up again tomorrow. By that time, the first batch of roof tiles were done cooking, so I removed them to cool. However, there wasn't going to be enough daylight to cook a second batch, so I hooked up the solar distilling rig again, taking the opportunity to empty out the sea salt from it, and started draining the pool, which I expected to be empty by evening. There wasn't much more I could do for my to-do list today, so I spent the last 3 hours of the day programming a new song for the music machine, Pancakes by Adhesive Wombat. Before I went to bed, I started another batch of roof tiles in the kitchen kiln overnight, and as I was journaling, my pencil broke, so I had to stop and make another one, getting to bed a little late. Week 17, Day 3. I started the roof tiles cooking early in the morning again, before doing my morning chores. The pool wasn't quite empty by the end of the day yesterday, so I let the remainder drain out into the ocean, and used my broom to sweep the particles into one corner where I could collect them easily. Then I mixed up a batch of potash to help keep the pool clean, and started it filling again. Then I got back to varnishing the pool cover, and had quite a bit left over, so I started varnishing the water wheel on the workshop, which I intentionally left stationary all day yesterday, so it could dry out for this operation. It was going to be a few days before I got it completely varnished and dried, so until then, I can't use most of the equipment in the workshop. I should still be able to use the lathe though, since I put a foot pedal in it. While I was in the workshop, I got my ladder and started laying down the roof tiles I cooked yesterday. I laid them on each other in an overlapping pattern, so the rain won't be able to leak through, but I noticed that I didn't really have anything to hold them down or together should the roof be affected by wind. So I mixed up a little mortar and stuck them all together into the beams in the roof as I went. I arranged some of them to form a drain on the back end that directed water into the cistern for the water wheel. Probably overkill, but again, nothing is wasted here. While I was up there, my mind wandered back to the parabolic calculator I was trying to design a few weeks ago, and to calculators in general for the next time I have to design something elaborate. Then it hit me that a simple way to design a calculator for multiplication and division would be to make a line graph. I don't know why I didn't think of this before. When I was done on the roof, I headed back into the workshop and constructed a small square frame with increments on the X and Y axes. To one corner I attached a small straight stick on a sliding pivot, and used some short lengths of string and plumb bobs to mark the X and Y values. The mathematical description for any straight line is y equals mx plus b, so I added some increments on the opposite side of the frame from the y-axis for my m-axis. By pivoting the free end of the stick to one of the m numbers, I can multiply the x number by it, showing the resulting y number on the vertical axis. If I want to divide a number, I just use the device backwards. Y is the input, m is the number I'm dividing it by, and x is the output. If I want to add two numbers together quickly, I can slide the pivot end of the stick up or down on the y-axis to represent the b in the equation, keeping the angle fixed, so x plus b equals y. Again, I can use it backwards for subtraction. It was a very fun and handy little tool, but I'm still a little embarrassed with myself that I didn't think of it when I was making the much more complicated trig rule. I stopped for lunch after this, and while I ate, I thought about what I needed to do next. The only other big thing on my list was touching up the tower exterior, but I kind of want to make it green, again, so it looks as much like a giant flower as possible. But I don't think I can use plant pigments for that because they would chemically degrade over time with exposure to sunlight, and I don't want to have to keep repainting the tower. That means I need some kind of mineral pigment, and while copper would probably have been best, again, it's much more valuable to me for metal than pigment. That only left me with olivine, which is a nice yellow-green color, but is difficult to separate from the soil. Olivine crystals are more common in the lava tubes, though, which brings me to the second big thing I've been thinking about, and that's the recent failure of my electrolysis rig. Even if it had been working properly this whole time, I wouldn't have had more than 1 gram of copper accumulated by now. I'm getting a bit impatient, and would like to move on to experiments with metallurgy, but I think I need more metal ore to do that. Between these two objectives, I need to head back to the lava tubes and start mining more intensively. However, I should make preparations to do so safely and start tomorrow, since the day is half gone already. I started by making some spare pickaxe heads for when the one I have inevitably breaks. This was kind of hard to do without the water wheel for power, but I made it work. Next, I knew I would need a better source of light down in the caves to navigate by, and I remembered that old-timey miners would literally have oil lamps tied to their helmets, so I took some time to make a small clay jar that I could fill with fuel, and a small glazed parabolic dish that I could attach to it. I didn't think I'd be able to use coconut oil for the lamp, because it solidifies even in this heat, and I didn't think chestnuts were going to be plentiful enough for their oil, so I decided to use ethanol instead. Finally found a use for this stuff. I prepared a scrap of cloth for a wick, and even made an easy-to-use flintlock lighter to light it with in the dark using a piece of stone and a crystal of iron pyrite mounted on a wooden spring that I could just pull back and flick to relight if the wick went out. The wick itself shouldn't burn up, just like a regular oil lamp, because the fuel in it is burning and preventing oxygen from reaching the fibers to burn. A little cord allowed me to attach the whole apparatus to my basket hat, though it didn't escape my attention that my hat was flammable, and I would literally be wearing a Molotov cocktail on my head. I made some cord to help me find my way out of the cave in an emergency, and twisted up some rope in case I needed to rappel down a steep or vertical incline, using some to create a climbing harness, to which I attached some ropes with slip knots to grip the rope and keep me from falling, and to allow me to ascend the rope by sliding these knots up the rope one at a time in an inchworm fashion. I wanted to map the lava tubes out a little more thoroughly, and dusted off my survey staffs and emergency compass for service again. Knowing the exact position of the cave entrance, I should be able to use the angle and distance measurements off of true north to map out the cave's interior relative to the rest of the island's surface features. I still had a couple of hours to kill at the end of the day, and I started working on programming the music machine again, before realizing that time was another thing I would not be able to keep track of underground. So I switched tasks and tried to build a pocket watch, or at least the closest thing I could to one. I prepared a small clay disc and a rubber band to make the main oscillating mechanism, like the cuckoo clock I made for the workshop, and carved out the smallest ratchet wheel I could make. To protect the delicate mechanisms, the only thing I really had to make a proper watch cover was a pair of coconut shells. Weird, but at least it should be durable. Also, to protect the mechanisms, instead of a face with hands, I drilled some holes in the side of the coconut shell and used marked rings of coconut shell nested inside to create a digital time display for hours, minutes, and seconds. There was even room inside the coconut shell for a bell to create a muffled chime on the hour. A key to wind it up, and a loop of cord to keep me from losing it, completed the watch. I added my lamp and watch parts to the last batch of roof tiles, placing them a little higher up in the chimney so they would cook more slowly, before I doused the lights for the night. Week 17, Day 4. I prepared my lunch for the day early in the morning, during my morning chores, but didn't head straight out to the lava tubes, varnishing the water wheel first, because I expect I'll need it soon. I then assembled my equipment and headed out. I erected a stick at the entrance of the cave before heading in, so I could calibrate my survey measurements. The lamp did indeed help me see around the cave better, if for no other reason than the fact that the light of the lamp wasn't shining directly in my eyes and partially blinding me. The additional light and means of safely navigating also allowed me to travel deeper into the tubes than before, which allowed me to find more minerals. One problem I had, though, was that I had a hard time telling the difference between ore and rock. Mostly what I was looking out for was shiny or jagged crystals growing on the rock's surface, like some kind of strange alien moss. Most of them were black crystals with metallic sheens to them, but some I could identify by color. Goldish ones were iron pyrite, silvery ones may be lead, silver, or both, and red ones may contain mercury or arsenic, almost like God's way of warning you which ones to avoid. I did find several deposits of yellow-green olivine this way, and I laid out a sheet of cloth to catch the crystals as I dislodged them from the wall. Honestly, I don't know how people could do this every day back in the old days to dig tunnels and mine. It seems like such a waste of time and energy. I mined for about 3 hours until it was time for lunch, which I wouldn't have known without my pocket watch. Since it was already prepared and eating didn't take very long, I took the opportunity to use the stick I put at the entrance of the cave to measure my position and elevation in it, marking the spot with another stick before using the staffs to survey and map the new sections of the cave as I went. I then mined for 3 more hours before heading back to base, my backpack loaded to the brim with minerals. What I need now is a way to separate them into their various kinds of metal, though many will probably be alloyed together. The only way I can think of to do that is to pan them, similarly to how these deposits sometimes form in nature, where a river causes different ores to collect at different parts of the stream by their weight. After grinding up some of the ores with a stone and playing around with panning them a couple of times, I got the idea to make a dedicated pot for this purpose, giving it shelves up the sides where minerals of particular densities will rest, and a parabolic slope so that the heavier an ore is, the harder it has to work to go up a step. I also made the pot intentionally unbalanced, so that it will shake as it's being rotated to agitate the ore particles. This should allow me to quickly separate the different ores into mostly one kind or another, though I still won't know for certain exactly which metals they are until I smelt them. Once I was done making the pot, I left it to dry overnight before going to bed. Week 17, Day 5. I started the centrifuge pot cooking when I got up in the morning, and prepared a little more varnish for woodworking later. Before I went back to the lava tubes, however, I wanted to work on a mechanism that would grind the ores for me while I was gone. Sometimes the rocks are in big chunks, so I'm going to need something to crush them before grinding them to a fine powder in something like the grindstone, which should make them much easier to separate and smelt. I thought about different methods for breaking down the big rocks first, and while a big mortar and pestle would be relatively easy, it's also going to send bits of useful ore and rock everywhere. Furthermore, if I did this operation in a clay pot or something to try and contain the particles, the pot would almost certainly be shattered by the percussion, as would almost anything I used as a hammer and anvil in time. Another thing I could do would need to involve some sort of leverage to crush the stones, almost like a nutcracker, and industrially, they use big cylinders with teeth on them to grab and crack the rocks. The problem with this is that I don't have anything strong enough to keep the rollers from being pushed apart by the presence of the rock between them, or a strong enough lever arm to not bend and crack if used as a nutcracker. I guess that leaves the mortar and pestle as the only option, though I would like to make some way for it to feed automatically into the grinder, which will necessitate me making it a bit smaller. However, if it's working all day in my absence, it doesn't need to be able to do things in bulk, just a little bit continuously. The first thing I did was find a couple of large, strong basalt stones to act as my hammer and anvil, and I ground them into the proper shapes. One I carved with a kind of funnel shape on it, and the other I gave a sort of wedge shape to fit into the first. I didn't have time to finish the mechanism, though, before I was off to the mines again. I noticed I wasn't very sore last night, but I was starting to feel it today. Works different muscles than gardening, particularly in my arms, but at least it keeps me out of the sun. The strike of the pickaxe echoed loudly in the tunnel. I stopped again at lunchtime to eat and map, before heading back to base and removing the centrifuge pot from the kiln. Once it was cool, I mounted it to the drill press in place of the thread spinner. It works kind of the same way, where the ore will be ground up slowly and poured into the centrifuge where it will be spun quickly. I then continued with the ore crusher mechanism, building a bamboo stand to hold up the anvil. Part of the problem I envisioned for this device, though, was that the violent action of the hammer going up and down would shake the anvil side around, or drive it into the floor eventually, unless the hammer and anvil were somehow mechanically connected to each other. Using a lever to raise the hammer would shake the mechanism from side to side, so what I decided I needed to do instead was to somehow raise the hammer vertically and drop it onto the anvil, while simultaneously having them connected to each other, such that the anvil would effectively be driven into the hammer as well. I also wanted to store as much potential energy in the hammer as possible, so it would hit harder. And while I could have done this by making it heavier, I opted instead to use some big rubber bands, so the hammer and anvil would be mechanically joined together and store spring energy in addition to gravitational potential energy. I just needed to somehow attach the anvil to the ground. In any case, I split and hollowed a few pieces of bamboo to use as molds for my giant rubber bands, and left them to set overnight. I'll vulcanize them in the morning. Week 17, Day 6. I loaded my rubber bands into the pressure cooker in the morning, which would be just fine for cooking them while simultaneously desalinating water, before doing a little more work with the ore crusher. I chopped up some bamboo to make both a vertical guide around the hammer to keep it in line, and a guard to keep stone particles from going everywhere, in addition to funneling them down into the grinder. put a simple guard on the downhill side of the anvil to keep any rocks smaller than a certain size from getting into the grindstone. Then I headed out to the caves for one more round of mining before the end of the week. There was a degree to which I expected to be more tired and sore than I ended up actually being. I think all the physical work I've done on this island has made me more fit over the last few months than I might have otherwise anticipated, in addition to the high-protein fish diet. I'm still tired and sore, though. As I went about surveying, I found a branch of the tube that led me back outside, and a little bit closer to my base to boot. This causes me to think that there may be a lot more minerals for me on this island than I originally thought, and a lot more lava tubes hidden under the ground and even in the middle of the forest that I just don't normally see because there are trees in the way. The only reason I found this one was because the original Polynesian settlers made a camp there. At the end of the day, I retrieved my rubber bands and connected them to my anvil mechanism. I had to grind a few extra grooves into it so I could tie the stone to the other mechanisms with cord. I then built a hopper near the top of the mechanism to hold the ore, and built a guard around the base of it, which I filled with concrete from my leftover stockpiles of lime, being careful to leave a spot where I could attach wheels to roll the thing around if I needed to later. I then went to bed, exhausted and sore, but looking forward to getting a break tomorrow. Week 17, Day 7. After my morning chores, I decided to try out the ore crusher, now having several bagfuls of ores separated and ready to crush. I took a little time to build a strong peg into the shaft of the water wheel to catch the loop of rope attached to the hammer and drag it up. I had to be careful though to make sure the peg wouldn't drag the whole apparatus up and twist it around the shaft, so I made a little hook that hung from the end of the peg on a hinge to grab the crusher. Once the hook approaches its apex, the hammer slides off and slams into the ore. I tested it out and there were some eccentricity issues with this design, as the hook started to drag the hammer toward the axle near the apex of the pull. I really needed it to pull straight up and down, so I rebuilt the mechanism with a pulley in the ceiling and a rope in between the hammer and the hook. This took me longer than I'd planned to get started, and it was a little fiddly, but eventually I got it working. The sound of the crushing hammer was so loud that I could hear it almost anywhere in the compound, though it was drowned out a little by the walls of the workshop and the water running down the water wheel. I spent a couple of hours varnishing my furniture after that, stopping to check on the ore crusher every hour to make adjustments and to change out the ore. I found that I had to keep running water in the centrifuge pot because it would splash out, so I used the hose for the washing machine to slowly trickle water in. It makes a bit of a mess. In addition to this, I found that the crushed ore wasn't entirely sinking to the bottom of the centrifuge like I expected, but a lot of it was floating on the surface of the water, creating a yucky gray scum that fouled the centrifuge a bit. I found this a bit annoying, but it jogged my memory that sometimes ore slurries are frothed to separate certain minerals from the solution, so I added a little soap. When I came back, however, I found that this had only made the scum worse. Over the course of the day, I just ended up scooping the frothy scum out and setting it to the side. But one of my ores produced so much of it that I started to think that maybe this froth was actually a light metallic compound of my ores that was sticking to the soap bubbles. I think I'll refine this scum after all, and see what happens. I'm kind of pleased with this happy accident. After lunch, I finished off the last of my varnish before spending most of the remainder of the afternoon programming a new song into my music machine. At the end of the day, I separated my newfound mineral wealth. I ended up with several main classes of minerals from this method, and a few small piles of trace minerals, but besides color and density, I couldn't really identify their constituents. I put the wet powders in jars to dry next to the kiln for the night, and spent the rest of the evening writing before going to bed. Blooper Reel. Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, hopefully we're getting the tinniness out of the mic, and I can get started on this because somehow, mysteriously, day one of this entire week has gone completely missing. So, we'll see what we can do to remedy that. Alright, is the mic warmed up? Alright, let's get back to square one, as I am so used to doing. It has now been officially... I'm pretty sure I made this mistake the first time. I noticed the texture of this tower's making sewing needles, drill bits, and pieces of kitchenware. Hold on a sec, I have something I want to add to that. Are you recording now? Okay, let's get on with it. Mouse. Where's the mouse? Hey there, thanks for listening all the way to the end. I'm excited to finally start playing around with some metallurgy next week. So, if you want to watch some more, or to be precise, watch me smelt some more, you can press the subscribe and bell buttons to get notified as soon as the kiln is warmed up and ready for them. While I'm not mining for gold with these videos, it would still help me out more than anything else if you could share this video with someone who you think would enjoy it. And since you apparently enjoyed it enough to watch it this far in, you can press the like button if you think I'm crushing it. There's also a dislike button you can press if you thought it was a grind to listen to, but I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't pick on me. No need to rubble it in. Also, if you'd like to talk about your own stories and perspectives on the episode, maybe about a time you went prospecting or hunting for minerals, or if you just want to chat about whatever, feel free to leave a comment down below. I genuinely love to hear them, and I'm always open to suggestions and corrections. That said, thanks again for listening, and hope to see you here again next week.